whenever you get us live, we'll start with the streaming. All right, thanks, Katie. Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tullahoma. Today is Sunday, November 7, 2021. So once again, welcome to those of you on Zoom, live streaming, and those of you who might be watching this as a recording. So our opening reading comes from Steve Jobs. As we have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow know what you truly want to become. I'm going to read that one more time. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow know what you truly want to become. Next, yes. So we'll now move on to the Chalice Lighting, and Cass will do the reading while I light.
All right. As we light our chalice today, let us remember that we are a part of a great community of faith. May this dancing flame inspire us to fill our lives with the Unitarian Universalist ideals of love, justice, and truth.
We'll now go on to announcements. So if you have an announcement, just raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. We can make your announcement. So any announcements? Yes, Chuck. You're muted.
Yeah. The usual, our Thursday night discussion group will meet via Zoom on Thursday night. Maybe we'll actually discuss a TED Talk this week. You have to show up and find out, or bring one, please.
So if you, add to that, I think.
What's that?
I think we're going. I would hope we'll do the latest climate change.
Yeah, we'll probably do that this week. Yeah.
Yeah, because we missed that. We didn't have a quorum really for this.
Right. Yeah. So if you want to join us and you need a link, just ask me or Tom or Tony or Gene or Patty or Rick if he was here. But anyway, one of us will give you a link. All of us will give you a link. Okay, that's all.
All right, thank you. Any other announcements? Yes, Tony.
Yeah, we've got a small church cleanup scheduled for next Saturday. We're just going to do some basic, try and take care of some of the leaves and knock the cobwebs off of some stuff on the inside. I had several people that got a hold of me yesterday that were interested in attending. I imagine if we start at 8, we'll probably be out of there by 10 or so. It's not a big deal, but we want to get things cleaned up. So when it's time to open church, we'll be ready to go. But appreciate anybody that shows up.
All right, thank you, Tony. All right, to follow up on that, I'll talk a little bit about the COVID numbers. So that's, I think, of interest to folks. So the numbers are continually going down in our 7-county region, and Chuck's tracking that for us. So thank you, Chuck. But they aren't going down as steep as they were, and they almost look like they're tailing out or going horizontal now. Chuck will say more. I looked at it this morning and just pulled up the numbers for our 7 counties from Friday's, the most recent data. So, okay, the number last Wednesday was 16, the week before was 20, the week before that was, I think, 26. So, it's going down the slope. As of Friday, Coffee County actually went up a touch. Warren and Lincoln County look like they're horizontal, not going down or up, and the other counties are going down still just a little bit. So I don't know what that means. It looked really good, like we're really headed down and going to get down in that below 10 range, but right now we'll just have to see. So Chuck, do you want to say a little more about that, or what's your take on it?
I just wanted to comment. I'm seeing that too, and it's troubling. When I look at the nationwide numbers, it has flattened out. We have plateaued at about 70,000 cases a day. We can't afford to plateau again. there may well be a Delta Prime, watch out, there may well be a Delta Prime surge coming, or an after surge, or whatever you want to call it.
Mm.
Because if we plateau, that usually means we're about to start going back up. I don't know why. I'm not offering any theories as to why. That's what the numbers are showing. Now Tennessee does not look that bad, but it is also, the transmission rate is going up. It's well below 1 in Tennessee, which means that the average numbers still come down. They're just not coming down as fast as they were, which is pretty much what Jim said. They're still coming down, but not as fast as they were. And they could level out, and that could put off that time when we get below 10, below 5. We'll just have to wait and see. Again, I have no explanation for why, other than this happens every time we start down the backside of a surge. People go, yay, we peaked, it's over. And they go out and party. And, it isn't over when you hit the peak. That's when you're not out of the woods. That's when you're exactly in the deepest part of the woods. You got as far to go coming out the other side as you did going up. So it's not time to relax until the numbers are down. And I think we relax too soon is the problem.
And with the vaccination rates, the state is at 49.2% total vaccination. Once again, our 7-county area is dragging behind by about 10 points still. So we're right around 40% vaccinated. So where we live, there's still the potential for lots of unvaccinated folks to get it, to spread it, to incubate it, whatever. So I agree with Chuck completely. We still need to be careful. It's still out there, hasn't gone away. So with that, we will now do any other announcements. All right, then we will move on to our responsive reading. Pardon? Oh, the responsive reader needs to rise. All right, this responsive reading is The Growing Darkness by Viola Abbott. As we move deeper into the season, there are some things we know.
Fall brings growing darkness that we cannot escape.
The nights become cooler and take on winter's chill.
The leaves on the trees and the blades of grass try on new suits of yellow, orange, red, and brown.
Life around us slowly retreats and goes to sleep. In the rest before renewal, the earth will remain.
Waiting, waiting, waiting for the time that they are returned to us, the warmth and the light.
So now it's time for our speaker, Gene Jones. And the topic I have here is what surprises us, surprises him. And if that's not correct, Gene, you certainly can straighten us out on that, but it's all yours.
Well, it's interesting. That's often been what I felt like was a joke, and that's that I want to be as surprised as you are. What comes out of my mouth, and sometimes that's really the case. I talked with Carrie back about 2 weeks ago and a little bit more, and she said, "Would you take the talk for us on the 7th?" And I said, "Well, give me a few days to think this over." And in the course of thinking it over, time passed and Carrie got in touch with me and said, "What'd you decide?" And I felt a twinge of guilt at not having gotten back with her before. And I suddenly blurted out, "Sure, I will." And then about 10 minutes later, I thought, what was I thinking? And so consequently, that's part of what I'm going to say. At the time I gave her that answer, I was looking at something that I felt was funny, but was really based on some truth. And that was the fact that one of the most safe airlines is Qantas Airlines, and they had a system that worked for them. And that system involved pilots writing up a form after every flight, specifically giving something that was a problem. And then the mechanic who addressed that issue had to give a written response to the pilot on the sheet of paper. And in some cases, those became kind of, more than kind of, they became funny responses. This was back in 2002. And I assume Qantas, though not having heard otherwise, was and still is the safest airlines flying. They've had no accidents that I've heard anything about, and they definitely hadn't had any accidents up until then. And so the pilots wrote up their comment or statement about something that they wanted to be addressed with their plane. And one of those was, a pilot said, it looks like the left inside main tire almost needs to be replaced. And the mechanic responded and said, we almost replaced the left inside front tire. So anyway, it got funnier than that, because one of the pilots said there's something loose in the cockpit. And the mechanic said something was tightened in the cockpit. The next was a pilot who said there are dead bugs on the windshield. And the mechanic said live bugs are on back order. The one of the pilots wrote a note that said there's evidence of a leak on the right landing gear. And the mechanic said the evidence has been removed. Another was the IFF is inoperative. And the mechanic says it's always inoperative when it's turned off. The another was the pilot said there's a suspected crack in the windshield. And the mechanic said, I suspect you're right. Another said the number 3 engine was missing. And the mechanic said the aircraft was the engine was located. It's on the wing on the right-hand side. The other was, and this one was, as you can tell, these were silly questions and silly right from the start. The pilots had to make up things to say. And another one said, there was a mouse in the cockpit. And the solution was, a cat has been acquired. So anyway, I was thinking of those when Carrie talked to me, and that's when I came up with the idea that what was I thinking is a good subject, rather than saying I want to be surprised by what I say. What I have is a story. I have thought about this story for quite some time. In Tullahoma, Tennessee, back decades ago, Hubert and Louise got married when they were teenagers. They lived with Hubert's parents for a while at 602 South Polk. And then within a matter of a year, Hubert had actually built them a house at 604 South Polk Street. And several things occurred. They had a daughter and a son within a few years, and the little boy was rambunctious, got into trouble all the time, ended up being beat up by himself at some of the things he did. And the little boy, on one occasion, when he was about 4, the mother was ironing clothes, and she was using one of those old wooden ironing boards with metal cross pieces at the back. The little boy was climbing into a big box and leaning against the bottom of it and flipping it up so that it would stand up. And then the rest of the game was he would lean against the side and it would flop back down again. Anyway, at one point he had it straightened up, and as he flipped the box over, he flipped his head against those cross metal pieces on the back of those old wooden ironing boards. And within a matter of about 30 minutes, he was at the Queen City Infirmary. That no longer is there, but Dr. King and Dr. King's wife stitched up the back of his head. A couple of years later, that same little boy and his mother, who was president or whatever the title is for the Women's Missionary Union for the Southern Baptist Church. At First Baptist, she was the WMU chairman, and there were people at the little boy's house. including some kids who were out with him in the yard. And he had a tire swing on a tree, and before long, he was on top, standing on top of the tire, and the other two young boys who were friends of his were hanging onto the tire. And as they were swinging, the limb broke. And when the limb broke, the tire ended up, and the two little boys on top of Hubert and Louise's son who lived there. And he cried a lot, but his dad was a tough disciplinarian and insisted that the little boy sit on the front porch in a swing and quit crying. A couple of weeks later, the little boy was pushing a wheelbarrow because Hubert Jones was a contractor, a brick mason, in fact. And the little boy was pushing the wheelbarrow just as fast as he could go. And when he crossed the sidewalk, the front end of the wheelbarrow hung on the sidewalk and flipped him all the way over, and he landed in the grass and broke his collarbone. So he ended up at Queen City Infirmary, and Dr. and Mrs. King patched him up again. As time went on, the young boy became early teens, and he was going to South Jackson Elementary, and he walked over there every day from Polk Street. He walked over that viaduct on Carroll that probably all of you have been over at some time or another. And he had been told by his father, don't ever ride on the back of a bicycle. And if you're familiar with the incline up and down on that viaduct over the railroad tracks, walking up the viaduct would really get to me at this point. I'd probably be panting by the time I got to the top. And it was a hot day, and the boy who lived next door came up on a bicycle. And this young boy was given the opportunity to ride on the back of that bicycle down to the bottom of the viaduct. But his father had said, don't ever get on the back of a bicycle riding with someone. So when they got to the bottom of the hill, the little boy was beginning to get frantic because he could see the back of his house on Polk Street. And the bicycle slowed down enough, and he jumped off. And the end result was scratched up hands from sliding on the street, and tears in his pants, his knees scuffed up. And then the question was, what was I thinking? So anyway, life progressed on, and the family moved to Dallas, Texas, because back then there wasn't much to do for brick masons in Middle Tennessee, except maybe a house that needed to be veneered occasionally or that was being built. So they went to Dallas. Their son ended up being in high school. And later in high school, he was driving his car with a couple of other friends who didn't have a car, taking them home from church. And as he was approaching a police car coming from the other direction, one of his friends in the back seat rolled down the window. And Hubert and Louise Jones's son thought, don't do this. But instead, the boy in the back seat screamed at the driver of the car, the police car. And in an anxious moment, the teenage boy took off. And the police car turned around, and within a couple of blocks, the teenage driver had veered back and forth on several streets and was running through places where he thought they couldn't follow him. And within a matter of moments, bright lights came on behind him, and the police car had been there the whole time. And he didn't end up getting a ticket, but he did say to himself, what in the world were you thinking? So anyway, he turned out to be a very lucky young man, and that luck followed him as time went along, because he ended up getting out of high school and followed the family trade. He became a brick mason, worked on high-rise buildings on swinging scaffolds, then cleaned elevator shafts on those same buildings. And eventually, one day after a couple of years of this, he said to himself, what are you thinking? He was a clumsy kid that had already been proven. A broken collarbone twice, a cut on the back of his head, a scar over his eye where he raised up and bumped the floor joist on the house his dad was building. So he decided to go back to school. So the smartest thing he ever did was he went back to the University of Texas at Arlington and finished up going to school there. And then he went to work a series of jobs. He could no longer lay brick and make enough money to support his new Lincoln. So he got a less expensive car, and he ended up getting a series of jobs to pay his way through school. And one of those was working in a grocery store. So Hubert and Louise's son worked in a small supermarket, and he, in fact, lived close enough that he walked to that store, and he loved the job. He really liked working in a grocery store, but it didn't pay enough. So through a series of jobs that were from customers, he ended up in a long string of doing different things. And always it was because somebody he had met in the grocery store offered him a job. So he became a guy loading buses at the downtown bus terminal. He became a guy then who was an assistant, or an assistant to the buyer at a real large firm. From there, he was offered a job by an air freight company named Emory Air Freight. And after that string, he had other jobs as well, including with a trucking company. And he went from Dallas to Houston, to Oklahoma City, to Salt Lake City, to San Francisco, to Tucson, Arizona, and then to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And in this long string, he focused entirely on himself, and he was rather selfish, and also still accident prone, and also rowdy, as his father was. And so anyway, the trucking company that he started with some trucks in Albuquerque, New Mexico, ended up with 30 pieces of equipment. And he was the speaker for the graduating class at the Albuquerque High School. They had tried to get the governor and a senator and some others, and finally they settled on a guy who owned a small trucking company. And the speech was enjoyable. I really liked it because the ending of that speech involved a poem that had become my favorite, Tom. And that poem was by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and it's entitled A Psalm of Life. And so what he basically said to the group was, whatever you do a good job, and eventually you'll become what you're supposed to be. And that was part of what was said in our reading this morning, I believe. And that was, sooner or later, you're going to be what you should be. So the young boy had a transportation company, Hubert and Louise Jones' son. And on vacation at one point, by the way, a company bought out the firm that he was furnishing trucks for and offered him to be their operations manager. And he became acquainted with a thing called a vacation. He had gone since being at the age of 10, when his dad bought him a bicycle and handed him the payment book, bought him a bicycle at Western Auto, and then handed him the payment book and turned and said, get yourself a job. So from then until years later, he had never been out of work any day in his life. And from what I know about that guy, he was only out of work once for about 3 months when the company he was working with went out of business. But the end result was the young man went to Florida on vacation and walked into a grocery store. And he was so impressed that he Googled the information on that grocery store. And then he went back to where he was living in Dallas, Texas, and went to work for that company. And that company, as time went along, had him working in 8 different stores, 12 years, opening 4 stores, and being an assistant produce manager in 5 stores. One of those stores he opened, by the way, was one where when he found out about it, he decided, I've got to be there. And that store was Tullahoma, Tennessee. And Hubert and Louise Jones's son, Gene, ended up helping open the store in Tullahoma. And by then, working for Publix and some other things that occurred in my life, the rowdy, reckless teenager began to realize that there were other things more important than himself. So as he worked for Publix, they concentrate on saying something good to every customer, making sure they're taken care of, that you're attentive to the needs of others. I moved to Estill Springs, Tennessee, and was one night I realized that I bought a house, and I realized that the house across the street that was the home of a widow was pretty much a recluse, had a truck parked in front of it with the lights on, and a guy in that yard with a flashlight. And he was flashing the light on that house. So I got in my car, pulled out of my garage and pulled up behind that truck, and was pretty apprehensive, but I said to the guy, excuse me, do you mind telling me what you're doing here? And it turns out the guy was with the power company. What had happened is we'd had a big storm the night before, and it broke her tree in half and split it down the middle. And a major portion of a tree was laying in her yard, and it had taken out the power lines and the phone line, and nobody knew how to get in touch with her. So I went to Waffle House because it took out my light as well, several of us around. And I drank coffee and read a book for about 2 or 3 hours. And then I came back home in the early hours of the morning, and the power was back on. And that morning I decided we needed to do something so that this didn't happen to strangers on our street, people that they didn't seem to know. Well, it turns out one of the neighbors didn't know her. He was mowing her yard, and he sawed up the tree, and I hauled the big branches and then rolled the logs that we had cut up out to the front of the house. And at that point, I realized we needed something so that this didn't happen again. So I started a neighborhood watch program. And the purpose was not because I was concerned about our safety from outside sources, but rather I was worried about people like the widow who was a recluse across the street. And we wanted to be sure, I felt, that we knew everybody up and down the road, and we knew when somebody was in trouble and we could help them. This isn't anything that any of y'all wouldn't have done. I'm talking to the choir. Y'all are great people with big hearts. But meanwhile, 3 days ago, I had some leftover material from when I bought my house and had to do some renovating. I had some things, including some rolls of roofing felt, and there was a truck over across the street putting a new roof on that widow recluse's house. So I walked over and addressed the guy who owned the truck that was there with the roofing company. And he said, sure, I'd like to have that material you've got. So I went back home, loaded it up in my car and took it over and put it in the back of his truck. And while I was doing that, a young man walked out of the house and said, hello, Gene Jones. And I was stunned because I didn't know this guy. It turns out that the woman was his grandmother. And he had realized that she had needs, and he moved from Florida to there. And my fear that maybe this was a new owner of the house, and that something had happened to this lady. It turns out he said, no, everything's fine. She's okay, and I'm here to take care of her. But what surprised me was the fact that he knew my name. And it turns out he had gotten my name from the neighbor who worked with me to clear the tree out of her yard. Again, these things are not things that none of y'all would have done. But the important thing about it for me was the fact that it signaled something that was really important, and that was not macro physics and macroeconomics, but rather micro. The small thing being what we can do as individuals to the circle around us and affect something that becomes a ripple effect, hopefully, and changes some things. So I then remembered the poem that I had read at the speech at the Tullahoma High School, at the Albuquerque High School years before, when I read to them a Psalm of Life. And the Psalm of Life says what I want to be the conclusion I got to, because the interesting thing about my talk was I had a beginning of my talk with with Carrie, and I had an ending with this poem. I just needed to be careful and lower the amount of things I covered in that 20 minutes in between. I'd like to read you this because this became almost my religion. In my transferring to different places, I was transferred once to Salt Lake City, Utah. And as protection of myself, I found and joined a church called the Unitarian Universalist. And I became acquainted with UU and took it from Salt Lake City to San Francisco, to Tucson, to Phoenix, to Albuquerque, and now to Tullahoma, Tennessee. I'm back home. My folks, my father had died and was buried in Oakwood by his mom, close to his mom and dad. My mother passed away, and she was buried and is buried in Oakwood next to my father. And I had to be in Tullahoma. So I had to come and help open the public store in Tullahoma, Tennessee. These things have made a change in my life and made me realize that the important thing was what is said by the poem, A Psalm of Life. With your permission, I'd like to give it to you. The poem says, "Tell me not in mournful numbers that life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not as they may seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returneth, was not written of man's soul. Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to find that each tomorrow brings us further than we were today. Art is long and time is fleeting. Our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating a funeral march to our grave. In this world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb driven cattle, be your hero in this strife. Trust not the future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury the dead. Act in the living present with your heart within and God overhead. Lives of great men oft remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us just some footprints in the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing over life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing, shall take heart again. So that's the message I gave to myself. And that's the fact that what's really important is just create some footprints up and down Patrick Street in Estill Springs, Tennessee. Thank you, y'all.
Beautiful, Gene.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much.
We'll now do our traditional closing, 414 in our hymnal.
As we leave this friendly place, love, give light to every face. May the kindness which we learn
light
light
our hearts till we return. It is now 10:47, so why don't we take a 10-minute break, come back in at about 10:57, 3 minutes to 11, and we'll start talk back.